Sometimes you look at the news and it feels like you're getting whiplash. Well, the last week of January 2026, that was a masterclass in it. The headlines were just overwhelming, totally contradictory, and they were pulling the country's attention in a dozen different directions all at once. So, how do you make sense of all that chaos when it's all happening at the same time? Let's try and break it down. So, the week kicks off with this just a sudden, gut-wrenching tragedy right at home. A headline that literally stopped everyone in their tracks. A mid-air collision over the Potomac River turns out to be the deadliest U.S. air crash since 2001.
But, before the country could even begin to process that loss, our attention gets yanked overseas. President Trump announces this massive show of force heading toward Iran, and he's using rhetoric that just cranked up global tensions to a breaking point.
And at the very same time, a deeply polarizing political story was blowing up back home. The FBI, now under Director Kash Patel, was on the ground in Georgia executing a search warrant connected to the long-disputed 2020 election.
So here's the thing. How does a country even begin to process these events when they're all happening at once? You've got a moment of profound national grief, the threat of an international war, and this seismic shift in domestic policy. That is what we are going to try and untangle here. So here's how we'll do it. We're going to look at each of these major stories one by one. First, the tragic crash over the Potomac, then the military standoff with Iran, then the super ambitious launch of the Trump Accounts program, and finally, we'll try to figure out what it all means when you put these wild contradictions together. All right, first up, the tragedy that unfolded in the skies just a few miles from the White House. The human cost was immediate and just staggering. 67 people lost their lives. Everyone on board, both the plane and the helicopter. There were no survivors.
Okay, so here are the core facts as we know them. Late on a Wednesday night, an American Airlines regional jet was on its final approach into Reagan National when it collided with an Army Black Hawk helicopter. And to make it even more heartbreaking, among the victims were celebrated U.S. and Russian figure skaters. Now, the first big clue from investigators came from an early FAA report that the Associated Press got its hands on. It noted that one single air traffic controller was doing a job that's normally assigned to two. That immediately raised all sorts of questions about staffing and procedures in what's supposed to be some of the most controlled airspace in the world. And right away, the public reaction split into two very different camps. While, much of the country was just in a state of mourning, President Trump quickly pivoted to political blame. He started pointing fingers at the previous administration and at diversity efforts within the FAA, even while admitting that the cause of the crash was still unknown. And that response itself became a huge story, raising this question of whether a national tragedy could even be a moment for unity anymore. So while the nation was still trying to grapple with that loss, on the other side of the world, the drums of war were definitely beating louder. The messaging coming out of the administration was it was starkly divided. On his Truth Social platform, President Trump used this really inflammatory language, talking about a massive armada that was ready for speed and violence. But then you had Secretary of State Marco Rubio testifying before Congress, framing it as a wise and prudent defensive move. It almost seemed like this two-pronged approach, designed to both intimidate Iran and maybe reassure our allies at the same time, a very high-stakes balancing act. And Iran's response? Well, it was anything but quiet. Their mission to the UN issued this direct, defiant statement, reminding everyone of the high cost of past U.S. wars in the region and promising to respond like never before if they were attacked. So yeah, the stage was set for a really dangerous confrontation. And then, in the middle of all this turmoil, the administration rolled out what it was calling one of the most transformative policy ideas ever, a plan to basically change the entire relationship between Americans and the economy. The timing alone was a statement, right? Pivoting from all this crisis to pure ambition. So the concept is called Trump Accounts, and in a nutshell, they are federally overseen savings and investment accounts. The whole point is to give every single American child a stake in the stock market from the day they are born. So you might be wondering, how do they actually work? Well, the funding is designed to come from 4 different places. It all starts with a seed investment from the federal government, but it's built to grow through contributions from family and employers, large-scale philanthropy, and even state governments. The foundation for every single account starts right here,
a direct $1,000 investment from the U.S. Treasury for every newborn. That money gets deposited into a passively managed index fund. The goal is to create a baseline of capital for every single American kid. And the philanthropic world jumped on board immediately and in a massive way. Michael and Susan Dell led the charge, pledging $6.25 billion to help fund accounts for all the kids born before the program's official start. And just to put that number in perspective for you, the Dell's donation alone is meant to help backfill accounts for 25 million American children under the age of 10. We're talking about giving them a financial foundation before they even finish elementary school. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent really captured the grand vision behind this whole policy with this powerful line. He called it an effort to create the greatest merger in world history. Basically, to fuse the interests of Wall Street and Main Street to make sure that when the market does well, every citizen does well right along with it.
Okay, so let's zoom back out. You have a week of tragedy, of military brinkmanship, and of this really radical policy ambition. What does it all tell us when we look at it together?
I mean, it's really like you're looking at a tale of two completely different narratives. On one side of the ledger, you've got crisis and confrontation, a horrific accident, military threats, a politically explosive FBI raid. But on the other side, you have this incredibly ambitious, future-looking vision of economic transformation. And these two stories were unfolding at the exact same time, creating that sense of national whiplash we talked about. It leaves us with this final, kind of lingering question. A week like this really feels like a stress test for a country, doesn't it? When a nation is forced to confront its deepest anxieties about safety and its highest ambitions for the future, all at the same time, what path does it choose? And what does that choice reveal about where it's all headed?